Step back in time and drift into the full story of America like never before. From the first native civilizations to modern cities, this bedtime journey uncovers struggles, triumphs, wars, and dreams that shaped a nation. Perfect for calm, immersive storytelling, this comprehensive historical journey will take you through centuries of history, showing how ordinary people, extraordinary events, and resilience built the United States we know today. Hi guys, tonight we will talk about the entire history of the United States of America. Before start, please like and subscribe my channel Sleepsy, and also let me know in the comment your country name and what it is the time for you. It always fascinated to join us all over the world. Now dim the light, take a deep breath, and let's start our journey tonight. Before there were borders, before flags waved in the wind, before maps gave this land a name, there was silence and life. Tens of thousands of years ago, long before the year 1492, human footsteps already echoed across this vast land. What we now call the United States was once a living world of forests, plains, deserts, rivers, and coastlines, untouched by Europe, unknown to kings, and free from empires. This land did not call itself America. It did not belong to anyone. It simply existed. Around 15,000 to 20,000 years ago, the first humans arrived, likely crossing a land bridge known today as Beringia, connecting Siberia to Alaska during the Ice Age. They did not know they were discovering anything. They were simply following animals, seasons, and survival. Over thousands of years, these people spread south and east. They adapted, they learned, they built civilizations, quietly, patiently, and deeply connected to the land. By the time Europeans arrived centuries later, millions of Native Americans were already living here, not as one group, not as one culture, but as hundreds of distinct nations. There were the ancestral Puebloans in the Southwest, building stone cities like Chaco Canyon as early as 850 AD. There were the Mississippian cultures, who built massive earth mounds near modern-day Illinois around 1050 AD, including the city of Cahokia, which once had more people than London. In the Northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy formed a powerful political alliance long before modern democracy existed. In the Great Plains, tribes followed buffalo herds with precision and respect. Along the Pacific coast, fishing societies thrived. In Florida, the Calusa ruled waterways without ever farming. This was not a primitive land. It was an advanced one, just different. Trade routes stretched thousands of miles. Copper from the Great Lakes traveled south. Shells from the oceans moved inland. Stories, beliefs, and traditions passed from generation to generation without books, without ink, without paper. Time moved differently here. Life followed the sun, the seasons, and the animals. People knew when rivers would flood, when crops would grow, when winters would come. Survival was not rushed, it was learned. Villages rose and fell naturally. Nature was not an enemy, it was a partner. Spiritual beliefs were deeply tied to the earth. Mountains, rivers, and animals held meaning. The land was alive, it was respected. Ownership was rarely absolute. The idea of fencing land, selling it, or claiming it forever was foreign. Children grew up learning stories, not dates. Elders carried memory. History was spoken, not written. Every fire at night was a classroom. Every hunt was a lesson. This continent was full, but quiet. There were no massive stone castles, no cannons, no iron armies, but there was balance. That balance began to shift slowly, unknowingly. Across the Atlantic Ocean, Europe was changing. By the 1400s, kingdoms were growing restless. Trade routes were blocked. Gold was scarce. Power was everything. Ships were being built larger, stronger, capable of crossing unknown waters. Europe did not know this land yet, but it was already looking for it. And the people here did not know Europe was coming. They could not imagine sails on the horizon. They could not imagine diseases they had never faced. They could not imagine a world where land could be owned, claimed, or taken. In the late 1400s, this quiet continent stood on the edge of history, unaware. Rivers still flowed freely. Forests still stretched endlessly. Cities rose and fell in harmony with nature. No one here knew words like colonies, empires, or New World. This was not the beginning of America. This was the world before America. A world complete in itself. A world about to change forever. As we move forward, remember this moment. Because once Europe looked west, this silence would be broken. Across the ocean, the world was changing. By the late 1400s, Europe was restless. Kingdoms were growing, populations were rising, and old trade routes were failing. Spices, silk, and gold came from Asia, but the land routes were controlled by powerful empires. Prices were high, access was limited, and Europe wanted more. So Europe began to look outward. Ships became stronger, navigation improved, compasses, maps, and stars guided sailors farther than ever before. What once felt impossible now felt tempting. The ocean was no longer a wall, it was a path. Portugal and Spain led the way. They searched for faster routes to Asia, hoping to bypass rivals and claim wealth directly. No one was looking for a new continent. They were looking for profit. In 1492, a turning point arrived. A sailor named Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish crown, crossed the Atlantic Ocean. After weeks at sea, his ships reached land. He believed he had reached Asia. He was wrong. But history had already changed. Columbus had arrived in the Caribbean. And though he never stepped foot on what is now the United States mainland, his journey opened the door. Europe now knew land existed across the ocean. And Europe did not forget. In the years that followed, explorers returned again and again. John Cabot explored parts of North America in 1497 for England. Spanish expeditions moved through Florida and the Southwest in the early 1500s. The French explored the St. Lawrence River by 1534. Maps slowly filled in. Curiosity turned into ambition. But exploration came with consequences. When Europeans arrived, they did not come alone. They brought animals, weapons, beliefs, and diseases. Smallpox, measles, and influenza spread rapidly among Native American populations who had no immunity. Entire villages disappeared, sometimes before direct contact even occurred. This was not intentional at first, but it was devastating. Within decades, native populations declined sharply. Some historians estimate that between 1492 and 1600, millions of indigenous people across the Americas died due to disease. The land grew quieter, the balance was broken. Europeans interpreted this silence as opportunity. They saw empty land where thriving societies once existed. They misunderstood what they were seeing. But misunderstanding did not stop them. Curiosity shifted into conquest. Spain claimed vast territories in the Americas, driven by gold, silver, and religious conversion. France sought trade, especially furs. England watched carefully, learning from the successes and failures of others. By the late 1500s, Europe was no longer just exploring. It was planning to stay. The idea of colonies began to form. Colonies meant land. Land meant power. Power meant control. To Europeans, land could be owned, fenced, and ruled. This idea clashed deeply with native traditions, where land was shared and respected, not possessed. Conflict became inevitable. Early encounters varied. Some were peaceful. Trade occurred. Knowledge was exchanged. But mistrust grew. Cultural misunderstandings widened. Violence followed. Still, Europe pressed forward. By 1600, the Atlantic world was connected. Ships crossed regularly. Information flowed. Wealth moved west to east. The fate of the continent had shifted. America, though still unnamed, was no longer isolated. And yet, from the European perspective, this was just the beginning. They believed they had found a new world. But for millions who already lived here, it was their only world. Europe did not see nations. It saw resources. Forests became lumber. Rivers became trade routes. People became obstacles or labor. The quiet continent introduced in Chapter 1 was now entering an age of noise. Cannons would replace silence. Borders would replace open land. Ownership would replace balance. But none of that had fully happened yet. In the early 1600s, the future was still uncertain. Europe had only begun to reach westward. Colonies were ideas, not realities. Survival was not guaranteed. The next chapter would decide everything, because exploration alone could not change history. Settlement would. And that settlement would be fragile, dangerous, and filled with struggle. As Europe looked west, it believed it was finding opportunity. What it truly found was a continent that would reshape the world, and itself, forever. Dreams crossed the ocean before people did. By the early 1600s, Europe no longer wanted to just explore the land across the Atlantic. It wanted to live there, to claim it, to profit from it. The idea of permanent colonies slowly took shape, not in comfort, but in desperation. The first true test came in 1607. That year, English settlers founded Jamestown, the first permanent English colony in North America, along the James River in present-day Virginia. They arrived with hope, but very little understanding of the land they had entered. Jamestown was not built for comfort. It was built for survival. The settlers faced immediate hardship. The land was swampy. Mosquitoes spread disease. Fresh water was scarce. Food was unreliable. Within the first year, many colonists died from starvation and illness. Winter was merciless. By 1609-1610, Jamestown entered a period known as the Starving Time. Food ran out, horses, dogs, and even leather were eaten. Of the roughly 500 settlers, only about 60 survived. The colony nearly disappeared. What saved Jamestown was not strength, but connection. Local native tribes, especially the Powhatan Confederacy, played a complex role. At times, they traded food. At other times, conflict erupted. The relationship was unstable, shaped by fear, misunderstanding, and survival on both sides. Jamestown survived by chance and persistence. To the north, another colony was forming, different in spirit, but just as fragile. In 1620, a group of English religious dissenters, later called the Pilgrims, crossed the Atlantic aboard the Mayflower. They were not searching for gold. They were searching for religious freedom. They landed in what is now Massachusetts and founded Plymouth Colony. Before stepping ashore, they signed the Mayflower Compact, an agreement to govern themselves. It was simple, but important. It showed early ideas of self-rule. But ideas could not stop hunger. The first winter was deadly. Cold, disease, and starvation claimed nearly half the settlers. Survival again depended on help from Native Americans. One man, Squanto, changed everything. Squanto had been captured years earlier by Europeans, taken to Europe, and later returned. He spoke English. He taught the settlers how to grow corn, fish local waters, and survive the land. Without native knowledge, Plymouth would not have survived. The famous Thanksgiving of 1621 was not a celebration of success. It was a moment of survival, a brief peace, a shared meal after unimaginable hardship. Colonies continued to grow slowly. Throughout the 1600s, English, Dutch, French, and Spanish settlements appeared along the eastern coast. Some were built for trade, others for religion, some for power. Life was harsh everywhere. Settlers faced disease, unpredictable weather, and constant uncertainty. Homes were small, food was seasonal, medical knowledge was limited, death was common. Religious freedom existed, but not for everyone. Some colonies, like Massachusetts Bay, founded in 1630, enforced strict religious rules. Those who disagreed were punished or forced out. Freedom had limits. Land became the center of conflict. European settlers believed land could be owned. Native tribes believed land was shared. Treaties were signed, broken, misunderstood, or ignored. Violence followed. Trust faded quickly. Still, more settlers arrived. By the late 1600s, colonies began to stabilize. Farms expanded, towns formed, trade networks developed. Tobacco became profitable in Virginia. Fishing and shipbuilding thrived in New England. But this growth came at a cost. Native populations continued to decline through disease, displacement, and war. Slavery began to appear as a solution to labor shortages. In 1619, the first documented Africans arrived in Virginia, marking the beginning of slavery in English America. Colonial America was taking shape, not as a dream, not as a promise, but as a struggle. These early colonies were fragile, uncertain, and divided. Survival required compromise, labor, and sacrifice. Nothing was guaranteed. Yet, despite hunger, cold, and fear, the colonies did not vanish. They endured. And in that endurance, something new began to form. Not a nation yet, not a united people, but a foundation. The land was no longer silent. The future was no longer unknown. Colonial America had been born. By the early 1700s, the Atlantic coast was no longer a line of fragile experiments. It had become a chain of living communities. 13 British colonies stretched from New Hampshire in the north to Georgia in the south. Each colony was different weather, different economies, different beliefs. Yet, slowly, quietly, a shared identity was beginning to grow. Life in the colonies followed the rhythm of the land. Most people lived on farms. Families worked together from sunrise to sunset. Crops like corn, wheat, and tobacco determined whether a year would bring comfort or hunger. In New England, small towns formed around churches and meeting houses. Fishing, shipbuilding, and trade filled the ports. Education mattered here. Harvard College was founded in 1636, long before independence was imagined. In the middle colonies, such as Pennsylvania and New York, diversity defined daily life. Quakers, Germans, Dutch, and Scots lived side by side. Farms were productive. Cities like Philadelphia became busy centers of trade by the early 1700s. In the southern colonies, large plantations dominated the landscape. Tobacco and rice created wealth, but depended heavily on enslaved labor. By 1700, slavery was deeply rooted in colonial society. African men, women, and children were forced across the Atlantic through the transatlantic slave trade. They worked fields, built cities, and created wealth they would never enjoy. Colonial prosperity rested on human suffering. Daily life was simple, but demanding. Homes were wooden, often cold in winter and hot in summer. Medical care was limited. Childhood was short. Many children worked by age 7. Death was familiar, yet people married, celebrated, and dreamed. Religion shaped identity. Church attendance was expected. Sermons lasted hours. In the 1730s and 1740s, a religious revival known as the Great Awakening swept through the colonies. Preachers spoke of personal faith, emotion, and equality before God. The Great Awakening challenged authority. People began to question power, not just in churches but in government. Trade tied the colonies together. Roads were poor, but ships connected ports. Colonial merchants traded lumber, fish, tobacco, and grain. Britain controlled most trade through laws like the Navigation Acts, passed in the late 1600s. These laws benefited Britain, but frustrated colonists. Still, loyalty to the British crown remained strong. Colonists considered themselves British. They celebrated the king, they followed British law. Few imagined independence, but something was changing. Colonial assemblies began making local decisions. Newspapers spread ideas, people discussed rights, taxes, and freedom over meals and in taverns. By 1750, the colonies were more than outposts. They were societies. Conflicts also increased. Land hunger pushed settlers westward. Native tribes were forced off ancestral lands. Wars erupted, including the French and Indian War, 1754-1763, which would soon change everything. The colonies fought alongside Britain, but learned something important. They could fight. They could organize. They could survive together. Differences remained deep. North and South lived differently. Wealth was uneven. Slavery divided morality. Power was unequal. Yet beneath it all, a shared experience connected them. Hard work, risk, distance from authority. The colonies were no longer just British possessions. They were becoming something else. A people shaped by land, struggle, and shared uncertainty. A quiet identity forming, long before anyone gave it a name. For most of the 1700s, the American colonies did not dream of rebellion. They dreamed of stability. Colonists saw themselves as loyal subjects of the British crown. They sang British songs. They celebrated British victories. They believed the empire protected them. But loyalty can quietly turn into frustration. The change began after a distant war. In 1763, Britain won the French and Indian War. The victory expanded British territory, but it came at a heavy cost. The empire was deeply in debt. Someone had to pay. Britain looked across the Atlantic. New taxes appeared, slowly at first. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, taxing newspapers, legal documents, and even playing cards. It was the first direct tax placed on the colonies. Colonists were stunned. They had no representatives in Parliament. The phrase spread through taverns and town halls. No taxation without representation. Protests erupted. Merchants boycotted British goods. Crowds burned stamped paper in the streets. For the first time, resistance felt organized. Britain repealed the Stamp Act in 1766, but made one thing clear. Parliament claimed the right to tax the colonies any time. Tension grew, not exploded. New taxes followed. The Townshend Acts of 1767 placed duties on glass, paper, paint, tea. British soldiers were sent to enforce order. Red-coated troops marched through colonial streets. Their presence felt heavy. In 1770, fear turned into blood. The Boston Massacre left 5 colonists dead after soldiers fired into a crowd. The event spread through newspapers, exaggerated and emotional. Trust was breaking. Britain backed off some taxes, but kept one: tea. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, giving the British East India Company control of tea sales. Colonists saw it as a trap. On a cold December night in 1773, men disguised as Native Americans boarded ships in Boston Harbor. They dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party was not quiet protest. It was defiance. Britain responded with punishment. In 1774, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, called the Intolerable Acts by colonists. Boston Harbor was closed. Local government power was removed. The message was clear: obey or suffer. Instead of fear, unity formed. In 1774, colonial leaders met in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress. They did not call for independence. They called for rights. Still, both sides prepared for war. In April 1775, British troops marched toward Lexington and Concord to seize colonial weapons. Shots were fired. No one knows who fired first. But the sound changed history. By 1775, the colonies were no longer asking for fairness. They were preparing for survival. Ordinary farmers became soldiers. Families chose sides. The road to revolution was not fast. It was slow, painful, inevitable, and once taken. There was no turning back. War did not arrive suddenly. It crept in quietly, one gunshot at a time. In April 1775, the first shots echoed across the fields of Lexington and Concord. Farmers stood against trained British soldiers, muskets cracked in the morning mist. By nightfall, nothing was the same. The colonies were no longer arguing, they were fighting. Word spread fast. Riders carried news from town to town. Church bells rang. Men left their fields and workshops and picked up old weapons. This was not a professional army. It was a people defending their future. In June 1775, colonial forces faced British troops at the Battle of Bunker Hill. The British won the hill, but lost over 1,000 men. The message was clear: the colonists could fight. That same year, the Continental Congress made a bold choice. They appointed George Washington as commander of the new Continental Army. Washington was calm, disciplined, and respected. He understood something crucial. Winning this war was not about victories. It was about endurance. The early months were brutal. The army lacked uniforms, food, and training. Soldiers marched barefoot. Many carried hunting rifles, not muskets. Winter came hard. At Valley Forge in 1777-1778, nearly 12,000 men camped in freezing conditions. Disease spread faster than bullets. Over 2,000 soldiers died without ever seeing a battlefield. Still, they stayed. Hope arrived in words before weapons. On July 4th, 1776, the colonies made an irreversible choice. The Declaration of Independence was adopted in Philadelphia. Written primarily by Thomas Jefferson, it declared that all men were created equal and that governments existed to protect rights. It was not just a document, it was a challenge to the most powerful empire on earth. Britain responded with force. Major cities fell. New York was captured in 1776. Philadelphia fell in 1777. At times, independence seemed impossible, but history turned quietly. In 1777, American forces defeated the British at the Battle of Saratoga. It was a turning point, France noticed. In 1778, France officially allied with the American colonies. Ships, soldiers, and money crossed the Atlantic. The war became global. Battles stretched from frozen northern fields to the swamps of the South. Civilians suffered. Homes burned. Families were divided. Neighbors fought neighbors. Freedom had a cost. The final act came in 1781. British General Cornwallis was trapped at Yorktown, Virginia. American and French forces surrounded him. French ships blocked escape by sea. After weeks of siege, Cornwallis surrendered. The war was effectively over. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the United States of America as an independent nation. The war had lasted 8 years. Thousands were dead. The land was scarred, but something impossible had happened. A group of colonies had defeated an empire, not with wealth, not with power, but with belief. And now, they faced an even harder challenge: building a nation. Winning freedom was only the beginning. Keeping it would be harder. After 1783, the new United States stood quiet but uncertain. The war was over, yet peace felt fragile. Cities were damaged. Farms were empty. Soldiers returned home with nothing but memories. There was no king now, no empire to guide them, only questions. At first, the nation tried to govern itself under the Articles of Confederation, written in 1777 and fully adopted in 1781. It was a weak system. The central government had no power to tax, no army to enforce laws, no strong leadership. States acted like separate countries. Money was scarce. Debts from the war piled up. Farmers lost land. Trade suffered. In 1786, desperation boiled over. Shays' Rebellion erupted in Massachusetts when farmers, crushed by debt and taxes, took up arms against the state government. The rebellion was stopped, but the warning was loud. America was unstable. Leaders understood something dangerous. Too much freedom could destroy the nation. In 1787, delegates from the states gathered in Philadelphia. Officially, they came to revise the Articles. Quietly, they planned something new. The meetings were held in secrecy. Windows were shut. Guards stood outside. History was rewritten behind closed doors. The result was the United States Constitution. It created a balance of power. 3 branches of government: executive, legislative, judicial. No king, no dictator. Power checked by power. In 1788, the Constitution was ratified. In 1789, George Washington became the first president of the United States. He did not seek the role. That mattered. Washington set a powerful example. He stepped down after 2 terms, proving leadership could be temporary. Trust began to grow, but fear remained. Many Americans worried the new government was still too strong. To calm those fears, the Bill of Rights was added in 1791. 10 amendments: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right to a fair trial. These rights became the nation's promise. Yet problems remained unresolved. Slavery was ignored. Native lands were claimed. Women had no voice. The foundation was strong, but incomplete. America was no longer a dream. It was an experiment. One that could still fail, and one that would be tested again and again. America was young, and it was restless. After 1800, the nation looked west and saw possibility. Wide rivers, endless forests, open plains that seemed to promise a better life. The idea spread quietly. Land meant freedom. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson made a bold decision. The United States purchased a vast territory from France. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the nation's size overnight. For $15 million, America gained land stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. It felt like destiny. Families packed their belongings. Wagons creaked forward. Trails formed where maps did not exist. Life on the frontier was harsh. Winters were brutal. Food was scarce. Disease followed every settlement. Still, people kept moving. The belief was simple. Somewhere ahead, life would be better. Explorers like Lewis and Clark set out in 1804, mapping rivers and mountains, meeting native tribes, and pushing American presence westward. But expansion had a shadow. Native American nations already lived on this land. Treaties were signed and broken. In 1830, the Indian Removal Act forced tribes east of the Mississippi to move west. The Trail of Tears followed. Thousands died from hunger, cold, and exhaustion. Progress came at a terrible cost. By the 1840s, the phrase manifest destiny defined the era. The belief that Americans were meant to spread across the continent. Railroads followed. Towns rose. Gold was discovered in 1848 in California. Dreams rushed west. So did violence. America grew richer and more divided. The dream of opportunity fueled the nation. But the question remained, who was the dream for, and who paid the price? By the mid-1800s, America was growing, and so were its divisions. The North was building factories, mills, and railroads. Cities like New York and Boston thrived with trade and industry. Immigrants arrived by the thousands, bringing labor and new culture. Life was changing fast. The South looked very different. It relied on plantations. Fields of cotton, rice, and tobacco stretched for miles. But this wealth depended on slavery. Enslaved African men, women, and children were forced to work the land, denied freedom, and treated as property. By 1820, the nation was uneasy. The Missouri Compromise tried to balance power, keeping the number of slave and free states equal. It worked temporarily, but tensions simmered. Every year, the debate grew louder. Abolitionists in the North spoke out. William Lloyd Garrison published The Liberator in 1831, demanding an end to slavery. Frederick Douglass, once enslaved, shared his story of survival, courage, and hope. Meanwhile, Southern leaders defended slavery as essential to their economy and way of life. They claimed it was necessary and even benevolent. This divide was not only about land or money, it was about humanity. It was about identity. Every new territory added to the nation became a battleground. Would it allow slavery or not? The Compromise of 1850 tried to settle disputes. California entered as a free state, but stricter fugitive slave laws angered the North. By 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed settlers to decide for themselves. Violence erupted in Kansas, earning it the nickname Bleeding Kansas. Families were torn apart. Communities were burned. The nation seemed on the edge of collapse. Even politics became a battlefield. The Republican Party, founded in 1854, opposed the spread of slavery. Abraham Lincoln, a quiet lawyer from Illinois, rose slowly, speaking of freedom, equality, and the danger of division. The country was split, not just geographically, but morally. The North saw freedom as necessary. The South saw slavery as survival. And everyone knew the tension could explode. By 1860, Lincoln's election triggered fear in the South. 7 states seceded from the Union before he even took office. They formed the Confederate States of America. America was no longer one country. It was 2. The stage was set. Brother would face brother. Friend would face friend. The nation teetered on the edge of war, and yet, through all the tension, life continued. Farmers planted crops, children played, merchants traded, towns and villages carried on, unaware how soon everything would change. The promise of the American dream now faced its greatest test, because freedom for some had been built on the suffering of many, and the coming conflict would demand sacrifice, courage, and endurance unlike anything the country had ever faced. In 1861, America took a deep, painful breath and exhaled into war. After decades of tension over slavery, states' rights, and power, the country could no longer hold itself together. The election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860 was the spark. 7 southern states seceded, forming the Confederate States of America, and the Union prepared to fight to preserve itself. War began quietly, but erupted violently. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. No one survived the first night unscathed. The nation woke to gunfire, cannon blasts, and the terrifying knowledge that brother would fight brother. The Civil War was not distant. It was everywhere. Every town, every farm, every family was touched. Soldiers marched in lines across fields, carrying muskets, bayonets, and hope. They slept on cold ground, under canvas tents, or in barns. Food was meager. Disease was relentless. Typhoid, dysentery, and measles killed far more men than bullets. In 1861, 1862, battles erupted across Virginia, Maryland, and Tennessee. At Bull Run, the first major battle, inexperienced soldiers learned the terror of war. Smoke hung over fields like a dark cloud. Horses screamed. Cannons shook the earth. Fear became as real as hunger. Lincoln understood the stakes. He needed leadership. He needed resolve. General George McClellan was cautious. General Ulysses S. Grant was relentless. Slowly, strategy and endurance began to turn the tide. The war was also about ideas. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all enslaved people in Confederate states free. The words traveled slowly at first, but their impact was profound. Freedom became a reason to fight, a light in the darkest hours. That same year, battles like Gettysburg left over 50,000 soldiers dead or wounded. Fields were scarred. Towns were flooded with grieving families. Silence returned at night, but it was heavy with sorrow. Women and children became part of the war effort. They tended to the wounded, grew crops, and managed households. Life did not stop, it adapted. The war dragged on, relentless and exhausting. By 1864, General Grant led a campaign in the South, wearing down Confederate resistance. Cities burned, railways were destroyed. Hope flickered like a candle in the wind. Finally, in April 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. The cost was staggering. Over 600,000 soldiers dead. Millions affected. Cities and plantations destroyed. Families broken. Slavery abolished. But hearts and laws still needed healing. America survived, barely. But the dream of freedom was now real, fragile, and uneven. The war had proven something fundamental. The nation could be united, but only through unimaginable endurance. At night, fields once filled with smoke returned to quiet. Survivors looked up at stars and wondered, could this nation, so young and scarred, rise again? The answer would take years, and it would test the very soul of the country. The guns had fallen silent, but the wounds of war were far from gone. After 1865, America faced a new challenge. The nation had survived the Civil War, but the work of rebuilding, both the land and the spirit, was just beginning. This period, known as Reconstruction, would last for more than a decade. The South lay in ruins. Fields were burned, plantations were destroyed, railroads were broken, cities were damaged, and families struggled to feed themselves. Former enslaved people now faced freedom, but freedom came with uncertainty, danger, and fear. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment in 1868 guaranteed citizenship, and the 15th Amendment in 1870 promised voting rights regardless of race. These laws were revolutionary. They promised a new beginning, but promises alone could not change hearts. In many Southern towns, life remained harsh. Former slave owners resisted change. Laws called Black Codes restricted the freedoms of African Americans, limiting work, movement, and rights. Violence was common. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan, formed in 1866, used terror to suppress newly freed people. Yet, despite fear and oppression, hope emerged. Schools were built for freed children. Communities formed around churches. Families reunited. Formerly enslaved people claimed land, farmed crops, and fought for their voices to be heard. The federal government tried to enforce change. Troops were stationed in southern states to protect rights and maintain order. Political battles raged in Congress as leaders debated the limits of authority and justice. Reconstruction was fragile, often contested, and deeply uneven. Meanwhile, the North was changing too. Cities grew rapidly with immigration and industry. Railroads stretched across states. Factories created jobs, but also crowded neighborhoods, long hours, and new social challenges. The nation was learning how to rebuild and grow at the same time. Reconstruction was not just about laws, it was about survival. Communities adapted, families endured poverty. Soldiers returned home to rebuild homes, farms, and lives. Women ran households alone, while men worked to restore stability. By 1877, federal troops withdrew from the South. Reconstruction officially ended. Progress had been made, but much work remained. Inequality and division persisted. The scars of war would remain visible for generations. Yet, in these quiet years, a nation learned an essential lesson. Resilience is not measured by victory alone, but by the ability to rise after devastation, to rebuild, to continue dreaming of freedom, even when the path forward is unclear. Night fell over the South. Fires flickered in small homes and tents. Families whispered stories of survival and hope. The United States, though battered, was learning to endure and to dream again. After the turbulence of the Civil War and the tentative years of Reconstruction, America entered a new era, a time of transformation, growth, and ambition. By the late 19th century, the nation was no longer just a collection of farms and small towns. It was becoming an industrial giant, reshaping the lives of millions, while drawing people from around the world into its promise of opportunity. The Industrial Revolution, which had begun in Europe decades earlier, now swept across America. Railroads stretched farther than ever, connecting the coasts and opening the vast interior. By 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, linking California to the east. Trains carried goods, people, and ideas across thousands of miles. Towns sprang up along the tracks, thriving on commerce and travel. Factories appeared in cities like New York, Chicago, and Pittsburgh, powered by coal and steel. Immense machines clanged day and night, transforming raw materials into tools, clothing, and products that had once been handmade. Work was demanding. Children labored long hours in factories. Men worked in noisy, dangerous conditions. Yet for many, factory jobs were a lifeline, a chance to survive and perhaps climb higher in a new America. This industrial boom created an insatiable need for labor. Millions of immigrants arrived from Europe between 1870 and 1900. Italians, Germans, Irish, Poles, and many others brought with them hope, skills, and determination. They lived in crowded tenements, faced discrimination, and often worked grueling hours, yet they also brought vibrancy to cities, new cultural traditions, food, music, and ideas. Their sweat and perseverance became the backbone of modern America. Meanwhile, the economy shifted. Railroads and factories created enormous wealth for industrialists like Andrew Carnegie, who built steel empires, and John D. Rockefeller, who controlled oil, wielded political influence. The gap between rich and poor was a constant tension beneath the hum of progress. Rural America was changing too. Farmers faced low crop prices and new machinery, which made work more efficient but also more competitive. Organizations like the Grange and later the Populist Party emerged to advocate for farmers' rights, fighting for fair rail rates, better credit systems, and political representation. The struggle between rural and urban America reflected a nation in transition, one balancing the promise of wealth with the realities of inequality. Immigration, industry, and urbanization reshaped society culturally as well. Neighborhoods became ethnic enclaves, Little Italy, Chinatown, and Jewish districts, where traditions from distant lands were preserved and adapted. Schools, churches, and social clubs helped communities survive the pressures of urban life, teaching children English, skills, and the values of a new homeland. The streets were crowded, noisy, and full of life, a mix of hardship and hope. The late 1800s also saw the rise of social reform. Women's groups fought for temperance, education, and voting rights. African Americans, despite the end of slavery, faced segregation and disenfranchisement, particularly in the South. Leaders like Booker T. Washington advocated education and self-reliance, while others like W.E.I.B. Du Bois demanded immediate equality. America was learning that progress was not just technological, it was also moral, social, and deeply personal. By the turn of the century, the United States had transformed. The population had swelled, cities had grown, and the economy was booming. Yet the nation was still uneven, still fragile in some ways, still learning to reconcile freedom, opportunity, and justice. Immigrants continued arriving, industrialists continued amassing wealth, and workers continued to fight for dignity. Life was busy, noisy, and relentless, but it was also full of possibility. In this period, the United States began to step onto the global stage. Its industrial power made it a trading partner, a lender, and eventually a military presence. The country that had once survived by farming and fishing now competed with European empires in steel, oil, and commerce. Yet, even as it grew outward, life for ordinary Americans remained a daily struggle of survival, work, and hope. And so, by the early 1900s, the nation had been reshaped. It had transformed from scattered colonies and plantations into a bustling, industrial, and immigrant-rich country. Streets were crowded, trains roared across the plains, factories produced endlessly, and families worked tirelessly to survive. America was still learning, still struggling, and still dreaming. The story of industry, immigration, and change shows a simple truth. Progress is never free. It comes with sacrifice, sweat, and sometimes suffering, but it also brings hope, connection, and the chance for something greater. Night fell across the cities and farms alike. Factory whistles blew their final calls, immigrants whispered prayers for safety, and families lit candles in small apartments and rural cabins. In every corner of this growing nation, people dreamed of a better life, even as they worked, endured, and persisted. America was changing, quietly but profoundly. It was becoming more than a land. It was becoming an idea. And that idea would soon face the ultimate test: war on a global scale, the Great Depression, and the rise of America as a superpower. By the early 20th century, the United States had grown in strength, industry, and confidence. The nation's factories, railroads, and growing population made it a rising power on the world stage. Yet, for decades, America had largely stayed out of European conflicts, focused on its own expansion, wealth, and dreams. That began to change with the great wars that reshaped not just the world, but the country itself. The first of these was World War I, known then as the Great War. It began in 1914, with Europe engulfed in conflict after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. At first, the United States stayed neutral. President Woodrow Wilson warned that war was terrible, and America had its own struggles to manage. Yet, neutrality was tested. American businesses traded with Europe, sending supplies, loans, and materials. The seas were dangerous. German U-boats attacked ships, and American lives were lost on the Lusitania in 1915. The attacks, combined with the Zimmermann telegram, a secret message from Germany proposing an alliance with Mexico against the U.S., shifted public opinion. In April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. American soldiers, the American Expeditionary Forces, arrived in Europe in 1918. They fought alongside French and British troops, turning the tide in critical battles like Argonne Forest. By November 11, 1918, the fighting stopped. Germany surrendered, and the world exhaled. The war changed America profoundly. Soldiers returned home, often haunted by the horrors of battle. Families mourned lost sons. Women had taken on new roles in industry, farms, and offices. African Americans migrated north in the Great Migration, seeking industrial jobs and escaping Jim Crow oppression in the South. Cities swelled with opportunity, but also with tension. The 1920s followed, a time of booming industry, jazz, and cultural change. But beneath the surface, inequality persisted. Farmers struggled with low crop prices. Many African Americans still faced violence and discrimination. The stock market, fueled by speculation, was a ticking clock. That clock exploded in 1929 when the Great Depression began. Banks failed, factories closed, millions lost jobs, families struggled to survive, children went hungry, people slept in shanty towns called Hoovervilles. America, despite its growth and power, was vulnerable, yet the nation endured slowly and painfully through the 1930s. The next global conflict began quietly in 1939. Europe erupted into World War II after Germany, under Adolf Hitler, invaded Poland. At first, America watched, trading supplies but avoiding direct conflict. Yet the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, changed everything. Japanese planes struck the naval base in Hawaii. Thousands were killed, ships were sunk, and America's isolation ended overnight. The United States declared war on Japan, and shortly after, Germany and Italy. Millions of Americans joined the military. Factories shifted from peacetime production to war production. Cars became tanks. Sewing machines produced uniforms. Factories ran 24 hours a day, powered by determination and urgency. American soldiers fought across the world. In Europe, battles raged in North Africa, Italy, and ultimately France on D-Day, June 6, 1944. In the Pacific, island by island, American forces pushed back against Japan. Cities were bombed, seas were treacherous, and victory demanded unimaginable sacrifice. By 1945, the war ended. Germany surrendered in May. Japan surrendered in September after atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Millions had died worldwide. Families mourned, soldiers returned, and the United States emerged as a superpower, holding influence unmatched by any nation in history. The wars had transformed America at home, too. Women, who had taken industrial jobs during the wars, had proven they could do the work of men. The seeds of the civil rights movement were planted as African Americans demanded equality after fighting abroad. Cities grew rapidly, suburbs expanded, and technology, from radar to jet engines, promised a new era. America now had responsibilities beyond its borders. It joined the United Nations in 1945, pledging to help maintain peace. It took part in rebuilding Europe through the Marshall Plan in 1948. The nation's economy boomed, fueled by innovation, industry, and a growing population. Yet the world had changed in ways that were still dangerous. The use of nuclear weapons, global alliances, and ideological battles hinted at new conflicts. America's role as a protector, innovator, and global leader had been cemented, but the cost of leadership was high. Night in America during these years was both quiet and uneasy. Families lit lamps in small homes. Soldiers wrote letters home from foreign lands. Factories hummed into the night. Children listened to radio broadcasts, sometimes singing along, sometimes silent, aware that the world was no longer a distant place. It was everywhere. The story of war and change teaches a deep truth. Survival is more than avoiding danger. Survival is enduring hardship, learning from loss, and emerging stronger. America had done that through 2 world wars, a global depression, and internal transformation. By the end of World War II in 1945, the nation had grown in power, technology, and confidence. But the future remained uncertain. The Cold War, civil rights struggles, and cultural shifts were waiting, challenges that would shape the next half-century. Even in the darkest nights, the nation had survived. It had learned to rebuild, and in the quiet hours, people dreamed of a better world, of opportunity, and of the promise that America could endure and thrive. The world had changed, yet the quiet fears of night returned once more. By 1945, America had emerged from World War II as a superpower. Its cities were thriving, factories were busy, and families were dreaming again. But across the oceans, a new tension was forming, one that would last for decades. The Cold War had begun. The United States and the Soviet Union were once allies, but now they were rivals. Ideology divided them. democracy and capitalism on one side, communism and totalitarianism on the other. Fear of nuclear weapons, espionage, and global influence shaped every decision. Families went to sleep wondering if the world might explode while they rested. Schools taught children about atomic bombs. Governments stockpiled weapons. The quiet nights of America now carried a subtle, invisible tension. By 1947, the Truman Doctrine promised aid to countries resisting communism. The Marshall Plan helped rebuild Europe, ensuring allies would not fall into Soviet hands. America became not just a nation, it was a guardian of a fragile peace. At the same time, a quieter, yet equally powerful battle was being fought at home. The civil rights movement was taking shape. Millions of African Americans who had contributed so much during the wars demanded the freedom they had been promised. The military was still segregated in the early 1940s. Schools and public facilities were divided by law. Housing and employment were deeply unequal. In 1954, the Supreme Court delivered a landmark ruling in Brown v. Board of Education, declaring school segregation unconstitutional. The decision was a beacon of hope, yet the road ahead was long. Resistance in the South was fierce. Families sending their children to school faced threats, protests, and violence. Leaders emerged who would guide a generation. Rosa Parks, by refusing to give up her seat in 1955, sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, teaching the power of quiet courage. Martin Luther King Jr., with words like rivers and dreams, showed the world that change could be achieved without guns, with patience, hope, and moral courage. The 1960s were years of turbulence and transformation. The Vietnam War drew young Americans into forests and jungles far from home. Television brought images of war into living rooms, smoke, suffering, and protest. Families prayed at night for loved ones overseas. Across the country, marches, sit-ins, and rallies demanded equality, freedom, and justice. At the same time, culture shifted in ways no law could mandate. Rock and roll blared from radios, teenagers danced, and voices spoke of rebellion, individuality, and change. The world felt larger, faster, louder. The quiet evenings of past generations had given way to a society questioning itself, its values, and its future. The space race became another symbol of ambition and fear. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first satellite in orbit. America responded with determination. NASA was formed in 1958, and by 1969, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. Families watched in awe, imagining possibilities beyond Earth, while still navigating life in neighborhoods, schools, and cities that were anything but perfect. The Cold War also shaped everyday life. Bomb shelters were built in backyards. Duck and cover drills in schools reminded children of danger, even during story time. Nuclear anxiety lingered like a shadow across decades, invisible but heavy. Yet, amidst global tension and domestic struggle, America continued to grow, invent, and dream. Civil rights laws, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, began to dismantle legal segregation. Women increasingly joined the workforce, demanding equality, opportunity, and voice. Immigration laws changed in 1965, bringing new waves of people from Asia, Latin America, and beyond, adding color, flavor, and vibrancy to cities and towns. The nation also faced internal reflection. Protests against the Vietnam War, movements for women's rights, environmental awareness, and cultural liberation transformed society. Television and newspapers made the world feel immediate. Music, art, and literature questioned norms, stirred emotions, and inspired action. Families, once quiet in evening routines, now listened, watched, and participated in history unfolding before their eyes. Even the economy reflected change. Suburbs expanded, cars and highways connected distant communities. Jobs shifted from factories to offices. Technology was accelerating, from early computers to space-age inventions. America was no longer just growing, it was evolving. Yet the nights of the Cold War era were still layered with uncertainty. Families slept, knowing that global conflict could erupt, that rights were still fragile, that dreams required vigilance. Yet they endured, as generations had before them. They persisted quietly, with hope that change could come peacefully, if only patience and courage were enough. The period between 1945 and 1975 reminds us of something profound. Progress is never linear, freedom is never guaranteed, growth requires courage, and change, whether social, technological, or political, arrives slowly, sometimes painfully, but inevitably leaves an imprint on every life, in every quiet bedroom, in every small town, in every city skyscraper. Americans witnessed transformation. The nation faced global threats, moral challenges, and cultural upheaval. Yet it endured, it adapted, it imagined a better future. By the end of the 1970s, the United States had faced the dual pressures of a global superpower and a nation reckoning with itself. Civil rights victories, technological leaps, and cultural revolutions had reshaped daily life. Yet challenges remained. Inequality, political tension, and the lingering threat of nuclear war reminded every citizen that survival and progress were intertwined. Night fell over America, as it always did. Children in suburbs and inner cities went to sleep, listening to parents recount a day of work, lessons, or marches. Soldiers and veterans reflected quietly. Leaders considered decisions that would shape the nation for decades. And across the country, people dreamed of freedom, equality, and the promise that America, for all its flaws, could continue to grow, endure, and inspire. The Cold War and Civil Rights era show us that history is alive, ongoing, and deeply human. Struggle and hope coexist. Fear and courage walk side by side. And in the quiet hours, as lamps dim and streets empty, the nation continues its story, learning from the past, shaping the present, and imagining the future. The 20th century had reshaped America in ways few could have imagined. Factories, cities, and railroads had created wealth, while wars and social struggles had forged resilience. By the 1980s, the United States had emerged as a global power, technologically advanced and culturally influential. Yet modern life brought new challenges, new conflicts, and a world moving faster than ever before. Technology began to change daily life. Computers, once massive machines in university labs, started to appear in offices and homes. The personal computer became common in the 1980s, giving families access to information and connecting communities like never before. Televisions grew bigger, brighter, and more central to life. News, entertainment, and culture streamed into living rooms, shaping opinions and inspiring imagination. The economy shifted yet again. Industry was no longer the heartbeat of American cities. Service jobs, technology companies, and financial markets became dominant. Cities evolved, suburbs expanded, and commuting became a part of daily life. While wealth grew for some, economic inequality remained, a quiet tension beneath the hum of progress. Families worked long hours, balancing opportunity and pressure, dreaming of a stable future. Global conflicts continued to influence American life. The Cold War lingered into the 1980s, shaping foreign policy and military spending. Events like the Vietnam War, which ended in 1975, left scars on society and veterans. The fear of nuclear conflict, though reduced, still echoed in schools, movies, and political debates. America had become a world leader, but leadership demanded constant vigilance and responsibility. In 1991, the Cold War officially ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. A new era began. America stood as the world's dominant superpower, with influence in trade, military, and diplomacy. Technology surged. The Internet, which had begun as a military experiment in the late 1960s, became a tool for communication, commerce, and culture. By the mid-1990s, it was changing the way people worked, learned, and connected. Yet, social challenges remained. The fight for equality, begun centuries earlier, continued. Movements for women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, and racial justice gained momentum. In 1992, the Los Angeles riots exposed racial tensions and inequities that had not disappeared. The nation continued to wrestle with the meaning of freedom, justice, and fairness. The turn of the century brought both promise and tragedy. On September 11, 2001, terrorists attacked New York City and Washington, D.C., killing nearly 3,000 people. The nation was stunned. Night fell over cities in silence, mourning, and reflection. Families watched news broadcasts, unsure of what the future would bring. The attacks reshaped foreign policy, security, and daily life, reminding Americans that safety was never guaranteed, even at home. In response, the United States led military operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, redefining global politics. Veterans returned home with invisible wounds. Families continued to endure, adapt, and dream. The nation learned once again that survival required resilience, patience, and unity. At the same time, society continued to innovate and evolve. Smartphones, social media, and global connectivity transformed how people communicated, learned, and even protested. The world became smaller, faster, and louder. Information traveled instantly. Movements for justice could spread across continents in hours. The nation had entered an era of rapid change, where opportunity and risk were intertwined. Politics became increasingly polarized. Debates over healthcare, immigration, the economy, and climate shaped daily life. Families discussed, argued, and hoped. Every election felt consequential. The voice of each citizen mattered, yet the challenges of governing a diverse modern nation were immense. Meanwhile, culture continued to flourish. Music, film, art, and literature reflected the struggles and dreams of ordinary people. Children grew up with access to media, technology, and ideas unimaginable to previous generations. Education became central, connecting citizens to knowledge and opportunity. America, once a land of farms and frontier towns, had become a nation of cities, ideas, and global influence. Yet, even with all the advances, the core truth of American life remained: survival, endurance, and hope. Families still worked to feed and educate their children. Communities supported one another through crisis. Citizens debated, protested, and dreamed. Night still fell over cities, suburbs, and rural towns alike, reminding everyone that despite change, life followed rhythms older than technology or politics. By the early 21st century, the United States had become a nation of contradictions, powerful yet vulnerable, innovative yet unequal, free yet constantly striving to live up to its ideals. The story of modern America is a story of growth, struggle, and adaptation. It is a story of individuals and families working through change, learning from the past, and imagining a better future. The quiet hours at night now hold screens instead of candlelight, keyboards instead of letters, and electric hum instead of train whistles. Yet the heart of the nation remains unchanged. People seeking opportunity, safety, and connection. America, built on centuries of struggle, conflict, and innovation, continues to evolve, still dreaming, still growing, still writing its story. And as the stars shine above cities, suburbs, and plains, Americans sleep with hope that the nation can endure, adapt, and inspire the generations to come. America's story is not finished. It never will be. From the time the first Native Americans walked across forests, rivers, and plains, to the settlers who crossed oceans in fragile ships, to the pioneers venturing westward, to the soldiers, immigrants, and workers shaping cities and industry, the story has always been alive. It is the story of people enduring, adapting, and dreaming. Every generation has faced its own challenges. The Revolution demanded courage and patience. The Civil War tested unity and morality. Industrialization reshaped work, life, and society. Wars on foreign soil challenged ideals. Social movements demanded equality. Technology and globalization brought the world to America's doorstep. And still, the nation grows, learns, and struggles. The truth about America is simple. It is a nation built on contradictions. Freedom and inequality, opportunity and struggle, innovation and responsibility. They exist side by side. These tensions shape every corner of the country. They echo in every family, every school, every office, and every small town. Yet through all the turbulence, the nation endures. People continue to work, to hope, and to dream. Communities find strength in shared struggles. Citizens rise to face challenges, innovate, and advocate. The heart of America is resilience. History in America is a living thing. It is written not only by leaders, presidents, or lawmakers, but by every ordinary person. The farmers, the factory workers, the teachers, the nurses, the soldiers, the activists, the dreamers. Every voice, every action, every story contributes to the whole. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. History is unfinished because it depends on us. Every day choices are made that will echo through the decades. Every action, small or large, shapes the future. The United States has endured wars, depressions, crises, and change. Yet its essence, the promise of freedom, opportunity, and resilience, remains. Its story is still being written by those awake now and those who will come after. Tonight, as stars twinkle over cities, mountains, plains, and oceans, the nation continues its journey. Families fall asleep, dreaming of safety, prosperity, and possibility. Children imagine new ideas. Workers finish their day's tasks. Leaders contemplate decisions that will shape tomorrow. And somewhere, across every corner of the country, hearts and minds keep building the story of America. This is the lesson of history. The past is not just a record of what happened, but a guide, a mirror, and a companion for the present. By remembering struggles, sacrifices, victories, and failures, we understand how far we've come, and how far we still have to go. America is unfinished, but that is its beauty. Its potential is boundless. Its story is alive. And every night, as the country rests, history whispers gently, reminding us that tomorrow offers new beginnings, new challenges, and new dreams. So sleep now, and remember, the story of America continues, not just in textbooks or monuments, but in the quiet courage of ordinary people, the resilience of communities, and the hope of generations yet to come. And in the calm of the night, the nation dreams onward, ever growing, ever learning, ever unfinished.